Section 149.43, Availability of public records for inspection and copying. A. As used in this section, 1. Public record means records kept by any public office, including, but not limited to, state, county, city, village, township, and school district units, and records pertaining to the delivery of educational services by an alternative school in the state kept by the nonprofit or for-profit entity operating the alternative school pursuant to Section 3313.533 of the Revised Code. Public record does not mean any of the following: A. Medical records. B. Records pertaining to probation and parole proceedings, to proceedings related to the imposition of community control sanctions and post-release control sanctions, or to proceedings related to determinations under Section 2967.271 of the Revised Code regarding the release or maintained incarceration of an offender to whom that section applies. C. Records pertaining to actions under Section 2151.85 and Division C of Section 2919.121 of the Revised Code and to appeals of actions arising under those sections. D. Records pertaining to adoption proceedings, including the contents of an adoption file maintained by the Department of Health under Sections 3705.12 to 3705.124 of the Revised Code. E. Information in a record contained in the putative father registry established by Section 3107.062 of the Revised Code, regardless of whether the information is held by the Department of Job and Family Services or, pursuant to Section 3111.69 of the Revised Code, the Office of Child Support in the Department or a Child Support Enforcement Agency. F. Records specified in Division A of Section 3107.52 of the Revised Code. G. Trial preparation records. H. Confidential law enforcement investigatory records. I. Records containing information that is confidential under Section 2710.03 or 4112.05 of the Revised Code. J. D&E records stored in the DNA database pursuant to Section 109.573 of the Revised Code. K. Inmate records released by the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction to the Department of Youth Services or a court of record pursuant to Division E of Section 5120.21 of the Revised Code. L. Records maintained by the Department of Youth Services pertaining to children in its custody released by the Department of Youth Services to the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction pursuant to Section 5139.05 of the Revised Code. M. Intellectual property records. N. Donor profile records. O. Records maintained by the Department of Job and Family Services pursuant to Section 3121.894 of the Revised Code. P. Designated public service worker residential and familial information. Q. In the case of a county hospital operated pursuant to Chapter 339 of the Revised Code or a municipal hospital operated pursuant to Chapter 749 of the Revised Code. Information that constitutes a trade secret, as defined in Section 1333.61 of the Revised Code. R. Information pertaining to the recreational activities of a person under the age of 18. S. In the case of a Child Fatality Review Board acting under Sections 307.621 to 307.629 of the Revised Code or review conducted pursuant to guidelines established by the Director of Health under Section 3701.70 of the Revised Code. Records provided to the Board or Director, statements made by Board members during meetings of the Board or by persons participating in the Director's review, and all work products of the Board or Director, and in the case of a Child Fatality Review Board, Child Fatality Review data submitted by the Board to the Department of Health or National Child Death Review Database, other than the report prepared pursuant to Division A of Section 307.626 of the Revised Code. T. Records provided to and statements made by the Executive Director of a Public Children's Services Agency or a prosecuting attorney acting pursuant to Section 5153.171 of the Revised Code other than the information released under that section. U. Test materials, examinations, or evaluation tools used in an examination for licensure as a nursing home administrator that the Board of Executives of Long-Term Services and Supports administers under Section 4751.15 of the Revised Code or contracts under that section with a private or government entity to administer. V. Records the release of which is prohibited by state or federal law. W. Proprietary information of or relating to any person that is submitted to or compiled by the Ohio Venture Capital Authority created under Section 150.01 of the Revised Code. X. Financial statements and data any person submits for any purpose to the Ohio Housing Finance Agency or the Controlling Board in connection with applying for, receiving, or accounting for financial assistance from the agency, and information that identifies any individual who benefits directly or indirectly from financial assistance from the agency. Y. Records listed in Section 5101.29 of the Revised Code. Z. Discharges recorded with a county recorder under Section 317.24 of the Revised Code, as specified in Division B2 of that section. A. Usage information including names and addresses of specific residential and commercial customers of a municipally owned or operated public utility. B. Records described in Division C of Section 187.04 of the Revised Code that are not designated to be made available to the public as provided in that division. C. Information and records that are made confidential, privileged, and not subject to disclosure under Divisions B and C of Section 2949.221 of the Revised Code. D. Personal information, as defined in Section 149.45 of the Revised Code. E. The confidential name, address, and other personally identifiable information of a program participant in the Address Confidentiality Program established under Sections 111.41 to 111.47 of the Revised Code, including the contents of any application for absent voters' ballots, absent voters' ballot identification envelope statement of voter, or provisional ballot affirmation completed by a program participant who has a confidential voter registration records or portions of records pertaining to that program that identify the number of program participants that reside within a precinct, ward, township, municipal corporation, county, or any other geographic area smaller than the state, and any real property confidentiality notice filed under Section 111.431 of the Revised Code and the information described in Division C of that section. As used in this division, confidential address and program participant have the meaning defined in Section 111.41 of the Revised Code. FF. Orders for active military service of an individual serving or with previous service in the Armed Forces of the United States, including a reserve component, or the Ohio Organized Militia, except that such order becomes a public record on the day that is 15 years after the published date or effective date of the call to order. GG. The name, address, contact information, or other personal information of an individual who is less than 18 years of age that is included in any record related to a traffic accident involving a school vehicle in which the individual was an occupant at the time of the accident. HH. Protected health information, as defined in 45 CFR 160.103, that is in a claim for payment for a health care product, service, or procedure, as well as any other health claims data in another document that reveals the identity of an individual who is the subject of the data or could be used to reveal that individual's identity. 2. Any depiction by photograph, film, videotape, or printed or digital image under either of the following circumstances. I. The depiction is that of a victim of an offense the release of which would be, to a reasonable person of ordinary sensibilities, an offensive and objectionable intrusion into the victim's expectation of bodily privacy and integrity. 2. The depiction captures or depicts the victim of a sexually oriented offense, as defined in Section 2950.01 of the Revised Code, at the actual occurrence of that offense. JJ. Restricted portions of a body-worn camera or dashboard camera recording. KK. In the case of a fetal infant mortality review board acting under Sections 3707.70 to 3707.77 of the Revised Code, records, documents, reports, or other information presented to the board or a person abstracting such materials on the board's behalf, statements made by review board members during board meetings, all work products of the board, and data submitted by the board to the Department of Health or a National Infant Death Review database, other than the report prepared pursuant to Section 3707.77 of the Revised Code. LL. Records, documents, reports, or other information presented to the Pregnancy Associated Mortality Review Board established under Section 3738.01 of the Revised Code, statements made by board members during board meetings, all work products of the board, and data submitted by the board to the Department of Health, other than the biennial reports prepared under Section 3738.08 of the Revised Code. Except as otherwise provided in Division A1 of this section, telephone numbers for a victim, as defined in Section 2930.01 of the Revised Code, or a witness to a crime that are listed on any law enforcement record or report. A pre-need funeral contract, as defined in Section 4717.01 of the Revised Code, and contract terms and personally identifying information of a pre-need funeral contract, that is contained in a report submitted by or for a funeral home to the Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors under Division C of Section 4717.13, Division J of Section 4717.31, or Section 4717.41 of the Revised Code. OA. Telephone numbers for a party to a motor vehicle accident subject to the requirements of Section 5502.11 of the Revised Code that are listed on any law enforcement record or report, except that the telephone numbers described in this division are not excluded from the definition of public record under this division on and after the 30th day after the occurrence of the motor vehicle accident. A record that is not a public record under Division A1 of this section and that, under law, is permanently retained becomes a public record on the day that is 75 years after the day on which the record was created, except for any record protected by the attorney-client privilege, a trial preparation record as defined in this section, a statement prohibiting the release of identifying information signed under Section 3107.083 of the Revised Code, a denial of release form filed pursuant to Section 3107.46 of the Revised Code, or any record that is exempt from release or disclosure under Section 149.433 of the Revised Code. If the record is a birth certificate and a biological parent's name redaction request form has been accepted under Section 3107.391 of the Revised Code, the name of that parent shall be redacted from the birth certificate before it is released under this paragraph. If any other section of the Revised Code establishes a time period for disclosure of a record that conflicts with the time period specified in this section, the time period in the other section prevails. 2. Confidential law enforcement investigatory record means any record that pertains to a law enforcement matter of a criminal, quasi-criminal, civil, or administrative nature, but only to the extent that the release of the record would create a high probability of disclosure of any of the following. A. The identity of a suspect who has not been charged with the offense to which the record pertains, or of an information source or witness to whom confidentiality has been reasonably promised. B. Information provided by an information source or witness to whom confidentiality has been reasonably promised, which information would reasonably tend to disclose the source's or witness's identity. C. Specific confidential investigatory techniques or procedures or specific investigatory work product. D. Information that would endanger the life or physical safety of law enforcement personnel, a crime victim, a witness, or a confidential information source. 3. Medical record means any document or a combination of documents, except births, deaths, and the fact of admission to or discharge from a hospital, that pertains to the medical history, diagnosis, prognosis, or medical condition of a patient and that is generated and maintained in the process of medical treatment. 4. Trial preparation record means any record that contains information that is specifically compiled in reasonable anticipation of, or in defense of, a civil or criminal action or proceeding, including the independent thought processes and personal trial preparation of an attorney. 5. Intellectual property record means a record, other than a financial or administrative record, that is produced or collected by or for faculty or staff of a state institution of higher learning in the conduct of or as a result of study or research on an educational, commercial, scientific, artistic, technical, or scholarly issue, regardless of whether the study or research was sponsored by the institution alone or in conjunction with a governmental body or private concern, and that has not been publicly released, published, or patented. 6. Donor profile record means all records about donors or potential donors to a public institution of higher education except the names and reported addresses of the actual donors and the date, amount, and conditions of the actual donation. 7. Designated public service worker means a peace officer, parole officer, probation officer, bailiff, prosecuting attorney, assistant prosecuting attorney, correctional employee, county or multi-county corrections officer, community-based correctional facility employee, designated Ohio National Guard member, protective services worker, youth services employee, firefighter, EMT, medical director or member of a cooperating physician advisory board of an emergency medical service organization, state board of pharmacy employee, investigator of the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, emergency service telecommunicator, forensic mental health provider, mental health evaluation provider, regional psychiatric hospital employee, judge, magistrate, or federal law enforcement officer. 8. Designated public service worker residential and familial information means any information that discloses any of the following about a designated public service worker. A. The address of the actual personal residence of a designated public service worker, except for the following information. I. The address of the actual personal residence of a prosecuting attorney or judge and 2. The state or political subdivision in which a designated public service worker resides. B. Information compiled from referral to or participation in an employee assistance program. C. The social security number, the residential telephone number, any bank account, debit card, charge card, or credit card number, or the emergency telephone number of, or any medical information pertaining to, a designated public service worker. D. The name of any beneficiary of employment benefits, including, but not limited to, life insurance benefits, provided to a designated public service worker by the designated public service worker's employer. E. The identity and amount of any charitable or employment benefit deduction made by the designated public service worker's employer from the designated public service worker's compensation, unless the amount of the deduction is required by state or federal law. F. The name, the residential address, the name of the employer, the address of the employer, the social security number, the residential telephone number, any bank account, debit card, charge card, or credit card number, or the emergency telephone number of the spouse, a former spouse, or any child of a designated public service worker. G. A photograph of a peace officer who holds a position or has an assignment that may include undercover or plainclothes positions or assignments is determined by the peace officer's appointing authority. 9. As used in divisions, a 7, and 15, 2, 17, of this section. Peace officer has the meaning defined in Section 109.71 of the Revised Code and also includes the superintendent and troopers of the State Highway Patrol. It does not include the sheriff of a county or a supervisory employee who, in the absence of the sheriff, is authorized to stand in for, exercise the authority of, and perform the duties of the sheriff. Correctional employee means any employee of the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction who in the course of performing the employee's job duties has or has had contact with inmates and persons under supervision. County or multi-county corrections officer means any corrections officer employed by any county or multi-county correctional facility. Designated Ohio National Guard member means a member of the Ohio National Guard who is participating in duties related to remotely piloted aircraft, including, but not limited to, pilots, sensor operators, and mission intelligence personnel, duties related to special forces operations, or duties related to cybersecurity, and is designated by the Adjutant General as a designated public service worker for those purposes. Protective Services worker means any employee of a county agency who is responsible for child protective services, child support services, or adult protective services. Youth Services employee means any employee of the Department of Youth Services who in the course of performing the employee's job duties has or has had contact with children committed to the custody of the Department of Youth Services. Firefighter means any regular, paid or volunteer, member of a lawfully constituted fire department of a municipal corporation, township, fire district, or village. EMT means EMTs Basic, EMTs I, and paramedics that provide emergency medical services for a public emergency medical service organization. Emergency Medical Service Organization, EMT Basic, EMT I, and paramedic have the meanings defined in Section 4765.01 of the Revised Code. Investigator of the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation has the meaning defined in Section 2903.11 of the Revised Code. Emergency Service Telecommunicator has the meaning defined in Section 4742.01 of the Revised Code. Forensic Mental Health Provider means any employee of a community mental health service provider or local alcohol, drug addiction, and mental health services board who, in the course of the employee's duties, has contact with persons committed to a local alcohol, drug addiction, and mental health services board by a court order pursuant to Section 2945.38, 2945.39, 2945.40, or 2945.402 of the Revised Code. Mental Health Evaluation Provider means an individual who, under Chapter 5122 of the Revised Code, examines a respondent who is alleged to be a mentally ill person subject to court order, as defined in Section 5122.01 of the Revised Code, and reports to the probate court the respondent's mental condition. Regional Psychiatric Hospital Employee means any employee of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services who, in the course of performing the employee's duties, has contact with patients committed to the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services by a court order pursuant to Section 2945.38, 2945.39, 2945.40, or 2945.402 of the Revised Code. Federal Law Enforcement Officer has the meaning defined in Section 9.88 of the Revised Code. 10. Information pertaining to the recreational activities of a person under the age of 18 means information that is kept in the ordinary course of business by a public office, that pertains to the recreational activities of a person under the age of 18 years, and that discloses any of the following. A. The address or telephone number of a person under the age of 18 or the address or telephone number of that person's parent, guardian, custodian, or emergency contact person. B. The social security number, birth date, or photographic image of a person under the age of 18. C. Any medical record, history, or information pertaining to a person under the age of 18. D. Any additional information sought or required about a person under the age of 18 for the purpose of allowing that person to participate in any recreational activity conducted or sponsored by a public office or to use or obtain admission privileges to any recreational facility owned or operated by a public office. 11. Community control sanction has the meaning defined in Section 2929.01 of the Revised Code. 12. Post-release control sanction has the meaning defined in Section 2967.01 of the Revised Code. 13. Redaction means obscuring or deleting any information that is exempt from the duty to permit public inspection or copying from an item that otherwise meets the definition of a record in Section 149.011 of the Revised Code. 14. Designee, elected official, and future official have the meanings defined in Section 109.43 of the Revised Code. 15. Body-worn camera means a visual and audio recording device worn on the person of a peace officer while the peace officer is engaged in the performance of the peace officer's duties. 16. Dashboard camera means a visual and audio recording device mounted on a peace officer's vehicle or vessel that is used while the peace officer is engaged in the performance of the peace officer's duties. 17. Restricted portions of a body-worn camera or dashboard camera recording means any visual or audio portion of a body-worn camera or dashboard camera recording that shows, communicates, or discloses any of the following. A. The image or identity of a child or information that could lead to the identification of a child who is a primary subject of the recording when the law enforcement agency knows or has reason to know the person is a child based on the law enforcement agency's records or the content of the recording. B. The death of a person or deceased person's body, unless the death was caused by a peace officer or, subject to division, H1, of this section. The consent of the decedent's executor or administrator has been obtained. C. The death of a peace officer, firefighter, paramedic, or other first responder, occurring while the decedent was engaged in the performance of official duties, unless, subject to division, H1, of this section, the consent of the decedent's executor or administrator has been obtained. D. Grievous bodily harm, unless the injury was effected by a peace officer or, subject to division, H1, of this section, the consent of the injured person or the injured person's guardian has been obtained. E. An act of severe violence against a person that results in serious physical harm to the person, unless the act and injury was effected by a peace officer or, subject to division, H1, of this section, the consent of the injured person or the injured person's guardian has been obtained. F. Grievous bodily harm to a peace officer, firefighter, paramedic, or other first responder, occurring while the injured person was engaged in the performance of official duties, unless, subject to division, H1, of this section, the consent of the injured person or the injured person's guardian has been obtained. G. An act of severe violence resulting in serious physical harm against a peace officer, firefighter, paramedic, or other first responder, occurring while the injured person was engaged in the performance of official duties, unless, subject to division, H1, of this section, the consent of the injured person or the injured person's guardian has been obtained. H. A person's nude body, unless, subject to division, H1, of this section, the person's consent has been obtained. I. Protected health information. The identity of a person in a healthcare facility who is not the subject of a law enforcement encounter, or any other information in a healthcare facility that could identify a person who is not the subject of law enforcement encounter. J. Information that could identify the alleged victim of a sex offense, menacing by stalking, or domestic violence. K. Information that does not constitute a confidential law enforcement investigatory record, that could identify a person who provides sensitive or confidential information to a law enforcement agency when the disclosure of the person's identity or the information provided could reasonably be expected to threaten or endanger the safety or property of the person or another person. L. Personal information of a person who is not arrested, cited, charged, or issued a written warning by a peace officer. M. Proprietary police contingency plans or tactics that are intended to prevent crime and maintain public order and safety. N. A personal conversation unrelated to work between peace officers or between a peace officer and an employee of a law enforcement agency. O. A conversation between a peace officer and a member of the public that does not concern law enforcement activities. P. The interior of a residence, unless the interior of a residence is the location of an adversarial encounter with, or a use of force by, a peace officer. Q. Any portion of the interior of a private business that is not open to the public, unless an adversarial encounter with, or a use of force by, a peace officer occurs in that location. As used in Division A17 of this section, grievous bodily harm has the same meaning as in Section 5924.120 of the Revised Code. Healthcare facility has the same meaning as in Section 1337.11 of the Revised Code. Protected health information has the same meaning as in 45 CFR 160.103. Law enforcement agency has the same meaning as in Section 2925.61 of the Revised Code. Personal information means any government-issued identification number, date of birth, address, financial information, or criminal justice information from the law enforcement automated data system or similar databases. Sex offense has the same meaning as in Section 2907.10 of the Revised Code. Firefighter, paramedic, and first responder have the same meanings as in Section 4765.01 of the Revised Code. B1. Upon request by any person and subject to Division B8 of this section, all public records responsive to the request shall be promptly prepared and made available for inspection to the requester at all reasonable times during regular business hours. Subject to Division B8 of this section, upon request by any person, a public office or person responsible for public records shall make copies of the requested public record available to the requester at cost and within a reasonable period of time. If a public record contains information that is exempt from the duty to permit public inspection or to copy the public record, the public office or the person responsible for the public record shall make available all of the information within the public record that is not exempt. When making that public record available for public inspection or copying that public record, the public office or the person responsible for the public record shall notify the requester of any redaction or make the redaction plainly visible. A redaction shall be deemed a denial of a request to inspect or copy the redacted information, except if federal or state law authorizes or requires a public office to make the redaction. 2. To facilitate broader access to public records, a public office or the person responsible for public records shall organize and maintain public records in a manner that they can be made available for inspection or copying in accordance with Division B of this section. A public office also shall have available a copy of its current records retention schedule at a location readily available to the public. If a requester makes an ambiguous or overly broad request or has difficulty in making a request for copies or inspection of public records under this section such that the public office or the person responsible for the requested public record cannot reasonably identify what public records are being requested, the public office or the person responsible for the requested public record may deny the request but shall provide the requester with an opportunity to revise the request by informing the requester of the manner in which records are maintained by the public office and accessed in the ordinary course of the public office's or person's duties. 3. If a request is ultimately denied, in part or in whole, the public office or the person responsible for the requested public record shall provide the requester with an explanation, including legal authority, setting forth why the request was denied. If the initial request was provided in writing, the explanation also shall be provided to the requester in writing. The explanation shall not preclude the public office or the person responsible for the requested public record from relying upon additional reasons or legal authority in defending an action commenced under Division C of this section. 4. Unless specifically required or authorized by state or federal law or in accordance with Division B of this section, no public office or person responsible for public records may limit or condition the availability of public records by requiring disclosure of the requester's identity or the intended use of the requested public record. An